There is a question buried somewhere in the long, complicated archive of human history. One of those questions that seems almost too big to hold in a single conversation, and yet once you hear it, you cannot quite let it go. Which was more powerful, the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company? At first glance, you might think this is a question for academics, for people who like footnotes and trade ledgers and the musty corners of archives. But stay with it for a moment, because what we are actually asking is something far more remarkable. We are asking which of two private trading companies, founded not by kings, not by generals, not by empires, but by merchants, bankers and shareholders, managed to accumulate the kind of power that had never before existed in the world. Power that bent entire civilizations. Power that moved the prices of spices by the handful across oceans thousands of miles wide. Power that raised armies larger than most European nations could muster. Power that, in one extraordinary case, technically governed more human beings than the population of Europe combined. Tonight, we are going to follow both of these organizations from their origins, from the cold counting houses of Amsterdam and the foggy warehouses of London, all the way through centuries of ambition, brutality, ingenuity and eventual collapse. We will sail with their fleets through the Strait of Malacca and up the Ganges. We will sit in the rooms where decisions were made that shaped the modern world. We will meet the men who drove these machines, and the millions of people who lived and died inside their grip. This is a sleep story, which means I am going to tell it slowly and with care. The pace is unhurried, the images are vivid. You do not need to remember dates or names unless you want to. Just let the story move through you like a long, slow tide. But here is a promise. This is not a dull story. This is not a story about paperwork. This is a story about the most extraordinary experiment in corporate power that the human world has ever attempted, and about what happened when two versions of that experiment collided, diverged, and eventually fell. Settle in. Let your body find a comfortable weight. And let's begin at the very beginning, which means we have to begin not in Amsterdam, not in London, but in a kitchen, in the middle of the 15th century, somewhere in Europe, where a cook has just run out of pepper. Imagine Europe around the year 1450. Not the Europe of grand boulevards and telegraphs and steamships, but an earlier, dimmer version. A Europe lit largely by candles and fireplaces, where winter was a serious and sometimes lethal inconvenience, where food without preservation was food that rotted, and where the difference between eating well and eating badly was often measured in a pinch of something dried and fragrant. Spices were not a luxury in the medieval and early modern world. They were closer to medicine, to magic, to money. Pepper preserved meat through the cold months. Cloves masked the taste of decay in an era without refrigeration. Nutmeg was believed to ward off the plague, a belief that, while medically unfounded, tells you something about how desperately Europeans valued it. Cinnamon appeared in the medicine cabinets of kings. Saffron was more expensive by weight than gold. And all of these things, every single one of them, came from places so far away that most Europeans could not even reliably locate them on a map. The spice trade had existed for thousands of years before Europeans entered it. Long before any Flemish merchant or English sailor ever heard of the Banda Islands, Arab dhows were sailing the monsoon winds between the Malabar coast of India and the ports of the Persian Gulf. Indian traders had been carrying cargo to Southeast Asia for centuries. Chinese junks moved through the South China Sea in great convoys. The world's oldest long-distance economy was already humming when Europe was still largely in the dark. What brought the spices to Europe was a chain of middlemen, and it was a very long chain. A sack of nutmeg might change hands a dozen times between the island where it grew and the stall in a Venetian market where it was finally sold. Each transaction added a cost. Each border crossing required a fee. Each political complication along the Silk Road or across the Ottoman-controlled Eastern Mediterranean made the cargo slightly more expensive and slightly more uncertain. By the time nutmeg reached a European buyer, it had travelled thousands of miles and passed through the hands of Arab merchants, Persian traders, Indian wholesalers, and Venetian importers. Its price was almost unimaginably higher than its original cost on the islands where it grew. Venice had built one of the most magnificent cities in the world on the back of this trade. The Venetian merchant fleet was the most sophisticated commercial operation in Europe, and for generations Venice held something close to a monopoly on the luxury goods flowing into the continent from the east. Venice's wealth was the wealth of the middleman, and it was spectacular. The city rose from the lagoon in marble and gold. Its merchant families built palaces. Its government was a sophisticated republic of commerce, governed by a council of merchant nobles who had turned the business of running a state into something indistinguishable from the business of running a trading empire. The Arsenal of Venice, the great shipyard on the eastern edge of the city, was, in the 15th and early 16th centuries, the largest industrial complex in the world. At its height, it employed several thousand workers who built and repaired ships on what we would today recognise as an assembly line, galleys moving through the covered docks in sequence, each station adding a component, oars here, rigging there, artillery. Further along, until the finished vessel emerged at the far end ready to sail, visiting dignitaries were astonished. The production rate when Venice was at war could reach one completed fighting galley per day. Nothing in Europe came close. The arsenal was financed by pepper. Not exclusively, but substantially. The profits of the Eastern trade underwrote the infrastructure that kept Venice militarily and commercially dominant in the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. When that trade was threatened, by the Ottoman advance by the Portuguese sea route, by the slow erosion of Venice's commercial advantage, the arsenal declined with it. The great shipyard fell into disrepair across the 16th and 17th centuries, its covered docks emptying, its workers dispersing, its machinery rusting in the lagoon air. Dante had placed the arsenal in the inferno as a scene of furious industrial activity, pitch being boiled, ships being caulked, the whole enterprise a metaphor for the infernal workshops of the damned. By 1700 the metaphor had become something sadder. Not the damned at work, but the damned at rest, the energy gone, the enterprise concluded, the city living on the memory of its former magnificence. This is the fate that waited for every institution that depended on controlling a single choke point in the flow of global trade. When the choke point moved, the institution died. Venice had dominated because the overland routes passed through its sphere of influence. When the sea route around Africa made those routes irrelevant, Venice could not adapt quickly enough. The lesson was legible to anyone who studied it, and the founders of the VOC and the EIC, who were not naive men, studied it carefully. But Venice's position depended entirely on the land routes remaining open, on the overland passage through the Levant and across the Ottoman Empire or through Egypt. And in 1453 something happened that would ultimately destroy Venice's commercial dominance and set in motion the entire chain of events that would eventually produce the East India Companies. The Ottoman Empire captured Constantinople. The fall of Constantinople did not instantly close the spice routes. That is a simplification that historians have spent considerable effort correcting. But it did change the political landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean in ways that made European access to overland trade routes more expensive, more complicated, and more precarious. It also created a psychological shock, a sense among the rulers of Western Europe that the East was now behind a wall and that if you wanted to reach it, you needed a different road. Portugal was the first to seriously attempt that different road. This tiny Atlantic kingdom, perched on the western edge of the Iberian Peninsula, with its back to Europe and its face to the ocean, had been pushing its ships down the coast of Africa for decades. Under Prince Henry, who is known to history as Henry the Navigator, a title that is somewhat misleading since he himself rarely sailed, the Portuguese systematically built up the knowledge and technology needed to venture further and further south. They mapped coastlines. They developed the caravel, a lighter and more manoeuvrable ship than anything previously built in Europe. They learned the Atlantic wind patterns. In 1488, Bartolomeu Dias rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, proving that the Indian Ocean could be reached by sea from Europe. In 1498, Vasco da Gama completed the first sea voyage from Europe to India, arriving at Calicut on the Malabar coast with a small fleet and an enormous ambition. The route to the spices was open, and Portugal moved with extraordinary speed to dominate it. The Portuguese Estado da India, the State of India, was not a trading company in the way we would recognise. It was an instrument of the Portuguese crown, staffed by soldiers and sailors who served the king. It operated through a system of fortified ports, Goa, Hormuz, Malacca, Mozambique, that allowed Portugal to control the key choke points of the Indian Ocean trade. For most of the 16th century, Portugal held a position of extraordinary privilege. They were not the only traders in the Indian Ocean. The Arab merchants and Indian shippers continued their ancient routes, but they were the most militarily aggressive, and their control of the sea lanes gave them enormous leverage. Goa, which became the capital of the Portuguese Eastern Empire after its capture from the Sultan of Bijapur in 1510, was the jewel of the Estado da India. In its 16th century heyday, it was a city of 60,000 people, larger than Lisbon, larger than most cities in Europe. Its churches were built in the full, elaborate Baroque style of the Counter-Reformation, financed by the profits of the spice trade and decorated with the iconography of a Christianity that was simultaneously converting Asian peoples and funding its missions from the proceeds of trading with them. The Basilica of Bom Jesus, completed in 1605, holds the preserved body of Francis Xavier, the Jesuit missionary who travelled through India, Southeast Asia and Japan in the 1540s and 1550s, encased in a silver casket and displayed to pilgrims 3 times per century. The spice trade and the missionary impulse were, in the Portuguese conception, part of the same divine project. But the violence of the Portuguese Indian Ocean Empire was real and immediate. Vasco da Gama's second voyage to India in 1502 included an episode in which a pilgrim ship carrying hundreds of Muslim pilgrims from Calicut to Mecca was captured, the passengers locked below decks, and the ship set on fire. The passengers burned or drowned. This was not an aberration. It was policy, or close enough to policy to be functionally indistinguishable from it. The Portuguese regarded the Muslim traders of the Indian Ocean as enemies in both a commercial and a religious sense, and their treatment of Arab merchants, Indian shippers, and any vessel that refused to carry a Portuguese cartaz, a license to trade, was frequently lethal. The cartaz system is worth understanding, because it prefigures much of what both the VOC and the EIC would later do. The cartaz was, in effect, a protection racket on an oceanic scale. Ships wishing to trade in the Portuguese-controlled Indian Ocean had to purchase a license from the nearest Portuguese fortress, and carry it as proof that they had paid their tribute. Ships found without a cartaz were liable to be attacked, and their cargo seized. The system generated substantial revenue for the Estado da India and imposed costs on every other trader operating in the ocean, effectively functioning as a tax on the entire maritime commerce of the region. The Portuguese had invented, or at least systematized, the concept of maritime sovereignty, the idea that a European power could claim jurisdiction over oceanic space and extract revenue from those who used it. The VOC and the EIC would argue about this concept, apply it selectively, and eventually push it to conclusions that would have astonished even the most ambitious Portuguese viceroy. But Portugal was a small country. It had perhaps 1.5 million people at a time when France had 15 million. It could project naval power with impressive efficiency, but it could not sustain the administrative and commercial weight of a global empire without straining every resource it had. By the 1570s, the cracks were showing. Corruption in the Estado da India was legendary. Ships were lost. Governors enriched themselves at the crown's expense. The fortified ports required constant maintenance and defence. And then, in 1578, the young King Sebastian of Portugal led a disastrous military expedition into Morocco and was killed, along with much of the Portuguese nobility, at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir. Portugal recovered, but weakened, and in 1580 the Spanish King Philip II claimed the Portuguese throne, uniting the 2 Iberian crowns. For the next 60 years, Portugal and Spain were effectively one country, and their combined colonial possessions, in theory, encompassed almost all of the world that Europeans had mapped. For the merchants of Amsterdam and London, this was both a problem and an opportunity. The problem was that Spain, and therefore now Portugal, was the enemy. England and Spain had been sparring for decades, and in 1588, the Spanish Armada's famous failure in the English Channel had not ended the conflict, only complicated it. The Netherlands were fighting their long revolt against Spanish rule, a conflict that would eventually produce the Dutch Republic. For English and Dutch merchants who had previously relied on Lisbon as their entry point into the eastern spice trade, buying spice that the Portuguese had already shipped around Africa, the union of the crowns suddenly meant buying from an enemy. The opportunity was simpler. If the Portuguese had proved you could sail to the East Indies and come back rich, then anyone with ships and determination could try the same thing. The Dutch went first, and their attempt was initially nearly catastrophic. In 1595, a fleet of 4 ships left Amsterdam under the command of Cornelis de Houtman. bound for the Spice Islands of what is now Indonesia. The fleet reached Java after a voyage of 14 months. The crew had been decimated by disease and conflict. De Houtman managed to antagonize almost every ruler he encountered, and his negotiations with the Sultan of Banten descended into violence. Of the 240 men who left Amsterdam, fewer than 90 returned, and yet they came back with spice. The voyage was a commercial disaster by any reasonable measure, but it proved the route was possible. What followed was something that, in retrospect, looks almost like a gold rush. Between 1598 and 1601, 15 separate Dutch fleets sailed for Asia. They were not coordinated. They competed with each other as fiercely as they competed with the Portuguese. They drove up the prices they paid to local producers and drove down the prices at which they sold spice at home, because they were flooding the market with cargo that arrived at unpredictable intervals. Merchants in Amsterdam watched this chaos and understood very quickly that the solution was not more ships, it was organisation. Meanwhile, in London, Queen Elizabeth I was watching the Dutch with a mixture of admiration and concern. England's own attempts to find a sea route to Asia had been characteristically ambitious and characteristically confused, looking for the Northwest Passage, the Northeast Passage, every passage except the one that actually worked. Now that the route around Africa was clearly viable, English merchants began lobbying the Queen for the right to organise their own expedition. On the last day of the 16th century, December 31st, 1600, Elizabeth granted a royal charter to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies. The English East India Company was born. 2 years later, on March 20th, 1602, the Dutch States General granted a charter to the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company. The VOC was born. 2 companies, the same ocean, the same goal, and a collision that was not merely inevitable but was, in a very real sense, the defining commercial conflict of the 17th century. Amsterdam in 1602 was one of the wealthiest cities on earth, which is remarkable when you consider that the Dutch Republic had only formally existed for a few decades, and was still, technically, in the middle of a war for independence from Spain. The Dutch had built their wealth not through conquest in the traditional sense, but through commerce, through the herring fisheries of the north, sea, through the Baltic grain trade, through the relentless ingenuity of their merchant class. The city itself was a marvel. Its famous ring of canals, the Herengracht and the Keizersgracht and the Prinsengracht, were being constructed in these very years, financed by the profits of global trade. The narrow canal houses that lined them were warehouses as much as homes, built with hoist beams projecting from their gabled rooftops to lift cargo from the barges below. Into this world, the VOC was born as a genuinely revolutionary institution. Its founding charter was not simply a license to trade. It was an act of institutional imagination that created something the world had never quite seen before. The problem that the charter addressed was capital. The previous Dutch voyages to Asia had been funded on a voyage-by-voyage basis. You invested in a specific expedition, the ships sailed, they returned, or they didn't, and then the partnership dissolved and the profits were distributed. This model worked for short, predictable journeys. It was deeply unsuited to Asia. The voyage alone took 14 months in good conditions. Trading in Asia required building relationships with local rulers, establishing factories and warehouses, maintaining a presence that extended across multiple seasons. No single voyage could do this efficiently. You needed capital that was committed for years, not months, and you needed enough of it to sustain losses without collapsing. The VOC's solution was to issue shares that could be bought and sold by anyone. 6 chambers, corresponding to the 6 Dutch cities that contributed capital: Amsterdam, Middelburg, Enkhuizen, Delft, Hoorn, and Rotterdam, raised subscriptions from investors. The total raised was 6.4 million guilders. The investment was locked in for 10 years initially, and crucially, investors could sell their shares on a secondary market, which immediately sprang into being in the courtyard of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the Beurs, designed by the architect Hendrik de Keyser, and opened in 1611. This is, by almost any measure, the birth of the modern stock market. Share trading had existed in rudimentary forms before. Venetian merchants had traded portions of their voyages, and joint stock companies had existed in England since the 1550s. But nothing had operated at this scale, with this degree of public participation, with this level of institutional sophistication, ordinary citizens of Amsterdam, carpenters, bakers, schoolteachers, invested in the VOC. The shares were initially priced at 3,000 guilders each, though fractional ownership was available. By 1620, the shares had roughly tripled in value. The governance structure was equally innovative and, to modernise, somewhat alarming. The VOC was run by a board of 17 directors, the Heren 17 or Lord 17, drawn proportionally from the 6 chambers, with Amsterdam holding 8 seats. These 17 men wielded powers that no private institution had ever previously claimed. The VOC could build forts, it could raise armies, it could negotiate treaties with foreign rulers, it could declare war, it could administer justice in territories it controlled. It was, in the language of its charter, empowered to act in the name of the States General of the United Netherlands, in all territories east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan, which is to say, essentially everywhere that mattered to the spice trade. In practice, this meant that the VOC in Asia was less a trading company than a sovereign power, and the man who most completely embodied that sovereign ambition was Pieterszoon Coen. Coen arrived in Asia for the first time in 1607 as a young junior merchant. He was 20 years old and had been trained in accounting and commerce in Rome, where he had worked for the firm of the Plancius family. He was thin, intense, methodical, and possessed of a clarity of purpose that bordered on the terrifying. He rose quickly through the VOC's ranks, not because he was charming or politically adept, he was neither, but because he was extraordinarily competent, and because his vision for what the VOC could become matched perfectly with the ambitions of the Heren 17 back in Amsterdam. Coen's idea was simple and brutal. The VOC should not be a trading company that operated at the sufferance of local rulers. It should be a territorial power that controlled the sources of the spices directly. The intermediaries, the Javanese traders, the Banda Islands merchants, the sultanates that had been selling spice to European ships at their own prices should be eliminated. The VOC should own the islands, it should control the labour, it should set the prices, and anyone who resisted this should be treated as an enemy and destroyed. In 1619, Coen acted on this vision with characteristic decisiveness. He attacked and burned the Javanese city of Jayakarta on the northwest coast of Java, which had been a trading port of some importance. On its ruins, he built a new city. He named it Batavia, after the ancient Germanic tribe from whom the Dutch believed themselves to be descended, a name that linked this new colonial capital to an imagined classical past of Dutch virtue and strength. Batavia would remain the headquarters of Dutch power in Asia for more than 3 centuries. The city that Coen built was a strange and melancholy thing in its early years. He modelled it on Amsterdam, complete with canals, which proved disastrously unsuited to the tropical climate. The still water became breeding grounds for malaria and dysentery, and mortality rates among the Dutch population were catastrophic. But Batavia was also, undeniably, an extraordinary achievement of colonial will. Within a generation, it had become the hub of an Asian trading network unlike anything the world had seen, a place where Chinese junks and Malay pros and Dutch East India men all converged, where pepper and cloves and nutmeg and silk and porcelain were sorted, warehoused, and dispatched to waiting markets across the globe. The VOC's financial architecture, meanwhile, was evolving in ways that were equally revolutionary. The company paid dividends to its shareholders regularly, sometimes in cash, sometimes in spice, sometimes in shares of new issues, and the returns were, by the standards of the era, spectacular. In some years, the dividend reached 45% or more of the invested capital. The Heren 17 were not universally loved. Some shareholders wanted the company to be wound up and its assets distributed rather than perpetually reinvested, but the power of the model was undeniable. Capital bred profit, profit bred more capital, and the whole engine turned. What fueled this engine, in the most immediate physical sense, was nutmeg, and the story of nutmeg is where the VOC's history takes its darkest and most irreversible turn. Nutmeg grew in only one place on Earth, the Banda Islands, a small archipelago of volcanic peaks rising from the Banda Sea in what is now eastern Indonesia. The entire global supply of nutmeg came from these 10 tiny islands, the largest of them no bigger than a small English county, and the people who grew and harvested and sold it were the Bandanese, a community of perhaps 15,000 people who had been trading their nutmeg with Arab and Malay merchants for centuries before a single European ship appeared on their horizon. Coen looked at the Banda Islands and saw not a community but a resource, and a resource that the VOC was not yet controlling. The Bandanese sold their nutmeg at prices they set themselves to whoever offered the best deal, including VOC competitors and English traders who had their own post on one of the islands. This was, in Coen's analysis, intolerable. The VOC needed a monopoly and the Bandanese were in the way of that monopoly. In 1621, Coen led an expedition to the Banda Islands. What followed was not a negotiation, it was a massacre. The Bandanese population was systematically killed by Dutch soldiers, by Japanese mercenaries hired by the VOC, by starvation when their villages were destroyed and their food supplies burned. Of the estimated 15,000 Bandanese people who had lived on the islands, fewer than 1,000 survived. The rest were dead or enslaved, or had fled into the sea and drowned. The island of Banda Neira, which had been a thriving trading port, was repopulated with Dutch settlers and enslaved workers brought in from elsewhere in the archipelago. Coen returned to Amsterdam and was celebrated. The Heeren 17 gave him gifts. He was, by the standards of his time, a hero, the man who had secured the nutmeg monopoly that would make the VOC fabulously wealthy for the next century. The mass murder of an entire people was understood, in the corridors of Amsterdam, commerce as a business expense. Coen himself returned to Batavia for a second term as Governor-General in 1627 and died there in 1629, during a siege of the city by the Sultan Agung of Mataram, a Javanese ruler who had correctly identified the new Dutch city as a territorial threat to his own power and had brought an army of tens of thousands to destroy it. The siege failed. Batavia's walls and artillery were sufficient, and Sultan Agung's logistical overextension eventually forced him to withdraw. But it was a close thing, and it demonstrated that the VOC's position in Java, however formidable, was not uncontested. Jan Pieterszoon Coen died of cholera before the siege was lifted, which is perhaps the appropriate coda for a man whose biography is a sequence of extraordinary violence, occasionally interrupted by administrative genius. His legacy in Batavia was the city itself, which his successors continued to develop according to his design. The canals he had ordered dug, modelling the city on Amsterdam with all the tragic consequences that implied for tropical public health, were maintained for decades, even as it became increasingly obvious that they were killing more people than they served. The Dutch attachment to their urban forms was, in Batavia as in many colonial cities, so powerful that practical inconvenience could not overcome it. The buildings went up in Dutch brick, their gabled facades and architectural insistence on European identity in a tropical setting where every such insistence came at a physiological cost. The Batavia of the mid-17th century was, despite everything, a genuinely cosmopolitan place. Chinese merchants, the Peranakan Chinese, as their descendants are still called in Indonesia, were essential to its commerce, operating as brokers, money changers, retail traders, and craftsmen in a community that the VOC needed but also feared. The Dutch periodically restricted Chinese economic activity, periodically relaxed those restrictions when commercial need became acute enough, and in 1740 committed one of the most catastrophic acts of colonial violence in Batavia's history, a massacre of the Chinese population triggered by paranoia about an alleged Chinese rebellion, in which somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 Chinese were killed over 2 days. The VOC administration in Batavia had ordered the killing. The Heeren 17 in Amsterdam, when they heard the news, expressed mild disapproval and recommended that future provocations be avoided. The Chinese in Batavia rebuilt. They had little choice. The city could not function without them, and they had invested too much across too many generations to abandon it. But the massacre of 1740 is another data point in the pattern of VOC governance. The company was capable, when it felt threatened, or when it calculated that violence was economically rational, of extraordinary brutality toward any population that it regarded as subject to its authority. We will return to this, because it matters, not just morally, which is obvious, but because the choice to rule through terror rather than through trade had consequences that would eventually contribute to the VOC's destruction. But for now, in the early decades of the 17th century, the VOC was ascendant. Its ships patrolled the Strait of Malacca. Its factories stretched from Persia to Japan. Its shareholders were growing rich, and in London, a younger, smaller, and considerably less well-organised institution was watching all of this and trying to figure out its own path. The English East India Company that received its charter from Queen Elizabeth on the last day of 1600 was, in its origins, a considerably more modest affair than the VOC would be. Where the Dutch company raised 6.4 million guilders from the start, the IC's first voyage raised about £30,000 sterling, a meaningful sum but not a staggering one. Where the VOC had the backing of the States General and operated as a quasi-governmental institution from the beginning, the EIC was more clearly a private venture, dependent on the Crown's favour, but not an instrument of state power in the same direct way. The first fleet left Torbay in April 1601, a few months after the charter was signed, under the command of James Lancaster, a seasoned sailor who had already been to the East Indies and back. Lancaster's voyage was, by the standards of the era, a success. His ships called at the Malabar coast, at Aceh in Sumatra, and returned to England in September 1603 with a hold full of pepper. Lancaster had also discovered a trick that would save many lives on future voyages. He had noticed that lemon juice prevented scurvy, a discovery that would not be formally established by science for another century and a half, but which Lancaster applied with practical pragmatism, issuing lemon juice to his crew from a silver spoon every morning. But the early history of the EIC was marked by a persistent instability that the VOC did not share. The English company reorganised its capital structure multiple times in its first decades. Unlike the VOC, which locked in its initial capital for a decade and then operated as a continuous institution, the EIC initially funded each voyage separately, a terminable joint stock system, where investors put money into a specific expedition and dissolved the partnership on its return. This meant that the EIC could never build the kind of fixed infrastructure in Asia that the VOC was constructing with such methodical energy. Every voyage started, in a sense, from scratch. The EIC also suffered from the perennial problem of English commercial life in this era. The interference of the monarch. The charter granted by Elizabeth gave the company a monopoly on English trade to the East Indies, but this monopoly was not guaranteed. It was a royal privilege that the sovereign could revoke or modify at will. Under James I, the company had to fight off interlopers who convinced the king that the monopoly was harmful to English commerce generally. Rival merchants occasionally obtained competing charters. The legal status of the company's monopoly was contested, challenged, and periodically reaffirmed in ways that consumed enormous amounts of energy and money. And yet, despite all of this, the EIC persisted. It sent ships to the Spice Islands, to the Coromandel coast, to the Persian Gulf. It established factories, the term used for a trading post from the word factor, meaning a trading agent, at Surat on the northwest coast of India in 1608, and this would prove to be one of the most consequential locations in the company's history. Surat was the premier port of the Mughal Empire, the greatest power on the Indian subcontinent, a state of extraordinary wealth and sophistication that made England look, by comparison, like a minor provincial kingdom. The Mughal Emperor Jahangir commanded revenues that dwarfed those of any European monarch. His court at Agra was a place of such opulence that even the hardened merchants of the EIC wrote home in stunned admiration when they first encountered it. The Mughals were not, to put it mildly, dependent on English goodwill. They traded with the Portuguese, with the Persians, with the Ottomans. They did not need the English. What the English had, however, was the ability to fight. In 1612, the EIC's ships defeated a Portuguese fleet off the coast of Surat, a battle called Swally, and this military success impressed the Mughal authorities sufficiently that they granted the English a firman, an imperial decree, permitting them to establish a trading factory at Surat. It was a small foothold, entirely dependent on Mughal sufferance, but it was a foothold. The man who most effectively built on this foothold in the early decades was Thomas Roe, who arrived at the Mughal court in 1615 as the first official English ambassador. Roe was a diplomat of considerable intelligence and even more considerable patience, qualities that were essential because the Mughal court operated on its own timetable and had absolutely no interest in adjusting its procedures to accommodate English commercial anxiety. Rose spent 4 years at the court of Jahangir, enduring elaborate ceremonies, navigating factional politics among Mughal courtiers, and gradually convincing the emperor that the English were worth keeping around. Not because they were powerful. Jahangir knew perfectly well they were not, at least not by Mughal standards, but because they were useful. Their ships could fight the Portuguese, their cloth and metals were of some interest, their desire to please in those early years was quite sincere. Rose's advice to the EIC directors back in London was acute, and in retrospect historically ironic. Avoid the temptation to conquer territory, he wrote. The profits of trade do not warrant the expense of empire. Hold the sea, he urged, and let the land trade flow to you. Do not build forts on the Indian mainland. Do not raise armies. Do not entangle yourself in the politics of the subcontinent, because those politics are older and more complex than anything an English merchant can navigate. For a time, the EIC actually listened to this advice. Through the middle decades of the 17th century, the English in India were genuinely modest, genuinely focused on trade rather than conquest, operating at the sufferance of local rulers and maintaining the diplomatic form of inferiority that their position actually required. This modesty was not entirely voluntary. The EIC's early Indian factories were genuinely precarious. The factory at Surat occupied a rented building on the edge of the port, a cluster of warehouses and living quarters surrounded by a wall that offered more psychological comfort than military protection. The company's servants, the word employee would be anachronistic since they were bound to the company by indentures and subject to its justice as well as its payroll, lived lives that were uncomfortable in ways that are difficult for a modern reader to fully appreciate. The heat was extraordinary, and the English brought with them absolutely none of the physiological or cultural adaptation to it that the local population possessed. They ate heavy English food in a tropical climate, they wore wool coats at ceremonial occasions, they drank enormous quantities of alcohol, partly from genuine preference and partly because the water was often unsafe without fermentation or boiling, and the discipline to boil water consistently was not reliably maintained. Dysentery was endemic. Malaria was common. A young EIC writer who arrived in Surat in, say, 1620 had perhaps a 50% chance of being dead within 5 years. Not from violence, but simply from the accumulated assault of disease in a climate for which his body was entirely unprepared. The company did not advertise this fact in its recruiting materials. Those who survived acquired something valuable: languages. The EIC's most effective early servants were almost without exception men who had learned Persian, the administrative language of the Mughal court and the lingua franca of Indian trade, and who had developed relationships with the Indian merchants, translators, and officials who were the actual machinery of commerce on the subcontinent. The Banyan merchants of Gujarat, who served as brokers, interpreters, and informal bankers to the EIC's factories, were essential to the company's operations in ways that the directors in London barely understood. A Banyan was not simply a translator. He was a credit reference, a political intermediary, a commercial intelligence network, and sometimes a personal financial lifeline for an EIC factor who had spent his advance and needed to manage until the next remittance arrived. The relationship between the EIC and Indian merchants was never an equal one. The power differential was always present, and it would grow in ways that would eventually become catastrophic. But in the early decades, it was genuinely interdependent. The Indian merchants needed access to European markets and European shipping. The EIC needed access to goods, credit, and local knowledge that it could not generate itself. Both parties understood this, and both parties were capable, at least some of the time, of behaving accordingly. The other thing the early EIC was learning slowly and painfully was Persian politics. The Persian Gulf trade, based at Gombrun on the Persian side of the strait, and at the island of Hormuz, which the Portuguese had fortified decades earlier, was enormously valuable, and it required navigating the court of the Safavid Shah of Persia, a sovereign whose diplomatic expectations were as elaborate as the Mughal emperors, and whose patience for commercial importunity was similarly limited. The EIC's adventures in Persia were full of the comedy and tragedy of cross-cultural misunderstanding, ambassadors who brought the wrong gifts, letters written in the wrong form of address, negotiations that stretched over years and produced agreements that dissolved when the next ambassador arrived without proper knowledge of the previous discussions. But the company was learning, and the company was changing. In 1657, Oliver Cromwell, Lord of England after the Civil War and the execution of King Charles I, rechartered the EIC on a permanent joint stock basis, finally solving the structural problem that had haunted it since its founding. From this point, the company had continuous capital, continuous management, and a continuity of institutional purpose that it had previously lacked. When Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660, he confirmed the charter and expanded the company's powers, including, crucially, the power to make war and peace with non-Christian princes and states, to seize interlopers, and to exercise civil and criminal jurisdiction over its own employees. Charles II also, in 1661, gave the EIC something it would not quite know what to do with for several decades: the city of Bombay. This port on the west coast of India had come to the English crown as part of the dowry of the Portuguese Princess Catherine of Braganza, who married Charles in that year. Charles promptly leased it to the EIC for a rent of £10 of gold per year. Bombay was not, in 1661, a particularly impressive acquisition. It was a cluster of islands joined, at low tide, malarial, thinly populated, its harbour excellent but its hinterland undeveloped. But its natural deep water harbour would eventually make it one of the most important ports in Asia. The EIC's early history, then, is a story of slow consolidation, persistent difficulty, and gradual institutional maturation. It was not, in its first 60 years, anything like the VOC. It was smaller, more uncertain, more dependent on the goodwill of local powers, and more frequently distracted by events in England itself, the Civil War, the Interregnum, the Restoration, that had no equivalent in the more politically stable Dutch Republic. But it was learning, and the lesson it was learning, slowly and painfully, was the same one the VOC had already internalised: that in Asia, commercial power and military power were not separable. You could not have one without the other. By the 1620s, both companies were present in the Spice Islands. The VOC, with its growing network of fortified factories and its increasingly aggressive territorial ambitions, and the EIC with a smaller presence, fewer ships, and considerably less violence but a genuine commercial footing. For a brief period, the two companies had even attempted cooperation. A treaty of defence signed in 1619 had theoretically united them against the Portuguese, but the alliance was always uneasy, and the interests of the two companies in the most profitable part of the trade, the Clove and Nutmeg Islands of eastern Indonesia, were fundamentally incompatible. The event that ended any possibility of Anglo-Dutch commercial cooperation in Asia happened in February 1623 on the island of Ambon, the main VOC headquarters in the Spice Islands, and it is known to history as the Amboyna Massacre. The English East India Company maintained a small factory on Ambon, operating at the sufferance of the VOC, which was the dominant power there. The relationship was tense but functional, until the VOC's governor on the island, Herman van Spult, discovered, or claimed to have discovered, an English plot to seize the VOC's fort. The evidence for this plot was extracted through torture. A Japanese mercenary soldier in VOC employ was waterboarded until he named names, including 10 English merchants who ran the EIC factory. The English merchants were arrested, subjected to the same treatment, and confessions were extracted in the same way. In February 1623, Herman van Spult held a trial of a kind, and then had 10 English merchants, 10 Japanese soldiers, and 1 Portuguese merchant executed. The method was beheading. News of the Amboyna Massacre reached England about a year later, and caused an eruption of outrage that rippled through English public life for decades. Pamphlets were published with lurid illustrations of the torture sessions. The murdered merchants became martyrs. The VOC was vilified. Diplomatic protests were lodged with the Dutch government. Compensation was demanded, argued over, partially paid, disputed again. The massacre became a defining grievance in Anglo-Dutch relations and was cited during each of the 3 Anglo-Dutch wars of the 17th century as evidence of Dutch perfidy. The publication history of the Amboyna Massacre is itself a study in the early modern mechanics of outrage. A pamphlet published in London in 1624 titled A True Relation of the Unjust, Cruel, and Barbarous Proceedings against the English at Amboyna ran through multiple editions. John Dryden wrote a play about it in 1673, 50 years after the event, at exactly the moment when England was again at war with the Dutch, and the play was a transparent piece of war propaganda designed to remind English audiences of the treachery that had been done to their countrymen and to justify the current conflict. The 10 dead merchants of Ambon had become national symbols, their names cited in parliamentary speeches and diplomatic correspondence with the same, routine invocation that such martyrs always receive, their actual historical individuality stripped away and replaced by the clean, useful simplicity of the symbol. What the symbol obscured was the complexity of the actual event. Herman van Spelt, the VOC governor who ordered the executions, was not a caricature villain. He was a company official operating in conditions of genuine uncertainty. The VOC's position in the Spice Islands was contested, its enemies were real, and the fear that the English might be colluding with local powers to undermine the Dutch monopoly was not entirely unreasonable, even if the specific plot he thought he had uncovered almost certainly did not exist in the form he imagined. The confessions extracted under torture were almost by definition unreliable. Torture produces compliance, not truth, but Van Spelt either did not understand this or did not wish to. He followed the legal procedures available to him in the VOC's administrative structure, and those procedures produced a verdict that required executions. The fundamental problem, which no amount of procedural formality could resolve, was that the VOC had acquired the power to execute people without any accountability to anyone outside its own chain of command. The Heeren 17 could sanction Van Spelt after the fact. They reportedly removed him from his position, though the details are murky, but they could not undo what had been done, and the absence of any external judicial oversight meant that the company's officials in Asia operated with a degree of unchecked authority that was, in the long run, dangerous to everyone who came within their reach. But its most important consequence was quieter and more structural. After Amboyna, the EIC effectively withdrew from the Spice Islands, not all at once and not without further attempts to maintain a presence, but the trajectory was clear. The VOC was too strong, too ruthless, and too deeply entrenched in eastern Indonesia for the English to compete. The cloves of Ambon, the nutmeg of Banda, the pepper of Java, these markets were Dutch, and they were going to remain Dutch. This forced withdrawal was, paradoxically, one of the best things that ever happened to the EIC. Expelled from the most valuable spice trade of the moment, the English company turned its attention to what was available to it, and what was available was India. The subcontinent's cotton textiles, its indigo, its saltpeter used in gunpowder, its silk, its calico. These were goods of a different character than spices. They were not produced in small, easily monopolized island archipelagos. They were manufactured across a vast subcontinent by tens of millions of skilled workers under the authority of the Mughal Empire. You could not simply massacre the Mughals and take the looms. You had to trade. This forced the EIC into a different kind of business. It developed different skills, diplomatic skills, linguistic skills, the ability to work within the Mughal system rather than trying to overthrow it. It built relationships with Indian merchants, bankers, and rulers that, while always transactional and often exploitative, required a degree of cultural sophistication that the VOC and its Indonesian strongholds never quite needed. The VOC, meanwhile, concentrated on building the most extractive monopoly system the world had seen. Having dealt with the Bandanese and their inconvenient freedom of commerce, the company turned to the clove-producing islands of Ambon and Ternate and Tidore, a volcanic chain in the Maluku group whose inhabitants had grown cloves for centuries. The VOC negotiated, and then enforced, a system called the Hongi Tokten, raiding expeditions in which VOC boats sailed through the islands and destroyed any clove trees that had not been licensed by the company. Islanders who grew unlicensed cloves were killed or enslaved. The supply of cloves was controlled with brutal precision to maintain the price in Amsterdam. The pepper trade in Java was similarly organised. The VOC required the Javanese principalities that grew pepper to sell only to the company, at prices the company set, under penalty of military force. The company's military capacity grew steadily. Its armies in Asia, composed partly of Dutch soldiers and partly of Asian mercenaries, were formidable by any regional standard. Its navy was larger than that of most European states. By the mid-17th century, the VOC was, by almost every measure of the moment, the larger and more powerful institution. Its capital was greater, its revenues were greater, its territorial holdings in Asia were far more extensive. Its monopoly on cloves and nutmeg was nearly complete. The EIC, by contrast, was still a trading company operating at the margins of the Mughal Empire, dependent on the goodwill of rulers who regarded the English as useful but not essential. But the divergence in their strategies, the VOC toward monopoly extraction, the EIC toward trade within a complex existing system, was also a divergence in their long-term trajectories. And this is where the story starts to become genuinely interesting. There is a painting in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam that depicts the harbour of Batavia in the 1650s. It is an enormous canvas, crammed with detail, dozens of ships riding at anchor in the Java Sea, their flags bright against a tropical sky, their hulls crowded with cargo. On the shore, the white walls and red-tiled rooftops of the Dutch city rise above the tree line. Church steeples pierce the skyline. Warehouses line the waterfront. It is, in its own terms, a picture of triumph, a civilization planted in the tropics by commercial will and maintained by an extraordinary logistical network that stretched from Amsterdam to Nagasaki. The VOC at its peak, in the 1660s and 1670s, was an institution without precedent in human history. Let us try to understand what that actually means in concrete terms. The company employed, at its height, somewhere between 30 and 40,000 sailors. This was more than most navies. It owned, at various times, between 150 and 200 ships, ocean-going vessels of the kind that required years to build and small fortunes to outfit. It had about 10,000 soldiers under arms in Asia, a military force larger than many European standing armies of the period. It paid annual dividends that, in some years, equalled 50 or 60% of the capital invested. Its shares, which had been offered at 3,000 guilders in 1602, were trading at around 18,000 guilders a share in the 1670s, a return that would be considered extraordinary even by the standards of modern financial markets. The Heren 17, the 17 directors who governed this empire, met 4 times a year in Amsterdam, rotating between the Amsterdam and the Middelburg chamber. These meetings were not public. The company's accounts were not disclosed to its shareholders, a practice that would eventually cause serious problems, but which, in the short term, gave the directors enormous freedom of action. The dividends were paid, the ships were sent, the monopoly was maintained, and the details were nobody's business but the 17 men in that room. The commodity that underpinned the most spectacular profits was still nutmeg, and the system by which the VOC maintained the nutmeg monopoly was, by any standard, extraordinary. After the destruction of the Bandanese population, the nutmeg gardens of the Banda Islands had been reorganised as perken. Plantations operated by Dutch colonists called perkeneers, who leased their land from the VOC and were required to sell all their nutmeg to the company at a fixed price. The enslaved labourers who actually grew and harvested the nutmeg were brought in from Timor, from Sulawesi, from Java, people with no connection to the land and no ability to negotiate their conditions. The perkeneers themselves were not free agents. They were bound by the company's rules, required to grow only nutmeg, not food crops that might make them more independent, and dependent on the VOC for virtually everything, including their food. The result was that a spice that grew wild on tropical volcanic islands and could be cultivated by any reasonably skilled farmer was transformed into an extraordinarily expensive luxury through the systematic elimination of competition and the exercise of military force. The VOC's profit margins on nutmeg, when they can be calculated, were sometimes in the range of several thousand%. A pound of nutmeg that cost perhaps 2 or 3 stivers on the island of Banda sold in Amsterdam for perhaps 80 or 90 stivers. Beyond the spice trade, the VOC operated what might be called an intra-Asian trading network that was, in its sophistication, the most complex commercial system operating anywhere on Earth in the 17th century. Dutch ships did not simply carry Asian goods to Europe. They also carried goods between Asian ports, trading silver from Japan for silk from China, trading Indian cotton for Indonesian spices, trading Persian rugs for Siamese deerskins. The network was held together by the VOC's network of factories, trading posts that stretched from Mocha in the Yemen to Dashima, the artificial island in Nagasaki Bay, where the VOC was the only Western organisation permitted to trade with Japan. Dashima is worth a pause. For over 200 years, from 1641 to the 1850s, The Dutch were the only Europeans allowed to trade with Japan, and they were confined to this tiny artificial island, barely the size of a city block, connected to the mainland by a single guarded bridge. Every year, a VOC ship arrived from Batavia. The Dutch merchants on the island were not permitted to set foot on Japanese soil. They could not practice Christianity openly. They were required to trample on a cross during certain ceremonies to prove they were not Catholic missionaries. And yet they stayed, because Japan's trade was valuable enough that these indignities were worth enduring. The VOC maintained this extraordinary relationship for over 2 centuries because it was, from the Japanese perspective, the least threatening variety of European. The Portuguese had been expelled because of their association with Catholicism and its political implications for Japanese authority. The Spanish were similarly suspect. The English had tried to establish a factory in Japan and failed, partly through commercial incompetence and partly because they could not match the Dutch in persistence and adaptability. The VOC won the Japan trade by being willing to do whatever the Tokugawa shogunate required, and they held it with a tenacity that is, in its own way, remarkable. The commodities that moved through Deshima were worth every indignity. Japanese copper was enormously valuable in Asian markets. The Tokugawa period had seen Japanese mining technology reach remarkable levels of productivity, and the copper from the Beshi and Ashio mines was some of the finest in the world. Silver moved in the other direction. Chinese silk was transshipped through Nagasaki because direct trade between Japan and Ming Dynasty China was officially prohibited, making the Dutch middlemen valuable precisely because their nationality placed them outside the restrictions of the Sino-Japanese relationship. The VOC also imported Dutch scientific instruments, books, and medicines into Japan, items that helped establish the tradition known as Rangaku, or Dutch learning, through which Japanese scholars in the Edo period absorbed European science, medicine, and technology through the narrow channel of the Deshima connection. There is something quietly poignant about this, that the same institution responsible for the Banda Massacre was also the conduit through which the Japanese first encountered modern anatomy, through which they learned about the Copernican solar system, through which Japanese surgeons first practiced dissection using European medical texts. The VOC was simultaneously one of the most brutal colonial institutions in human history, and one of the most significant channels of scientific exchange in the early modern world. History rarely permits simple moral accounting. What the Deshima connection also illustrates is the VOC's extraordinary geographic imagination. The company did not think in terms of one trade route or one commodity. Its strategists, men like Pieterszoon Coen, like Anthony van Diemen, who sponsored Abel Tasman's famous Pacific voyages, like Joan Metsuika, who governed Batavia for a remarkable 22 years, thought in terms of an integrated Asian commercial system, a web of production, exchange, and distribution that could be optimized as a whole, rather than managed as a collection of separate ventures. Van Diemen, who served as Governor-General from 1636 to 1645, is a figure who deserves more attention than history generally gives him. He commissioned the voyages of Abel Tasman that first charted the southern coasts of Australia and New Zealand, establishing that these landmasses existed, though without quite determining their value to the VOC, which remained focused on the more immediately profitable territories to the north. Van Diemen also presided over the company's most expansive territorial acquisitions in Ceylon and on the Coromandel coast of India, acquiring positions that would eventually bring the VOC into direct competition with the EIC in the very territory where the English were strongest. For a period in the 1640s and 1650s, it genuinely seemed possible that the VOC might displace the EIC entirely from Indian trade. The company established a major factory at Pulicat, on the southeastern coast of India, and developed the trade in Indian textiles, especially the fine cottons of the Coromandel weaving towns that were essential for buying spice in the Indonesian archipelago without having to export precious metals. This was a sophisticated insight. The Indonesian spice producers would accept Indian cotton cloth as payment, more readily than Dutch coin, because the cloth was itself useful and familiar, a commodity with established value in their own markets. The VOC thus operated a triangular trade in which Indian textiles financed Indonesian spice, which financed returns to Amsterdam, which financed further Indian textile purchases. The system was elegantly self-financing at the level of the Asian network, reducing the drain on Dutch silver reserves. But the VOC's presence in India was always secondary to its Indonesian focus, and this strategic prioritization would prove consequential. While the Dutch were maximizing their grip on the Spice Islands, the English were building relationships, infrastructure, and eventually military power on the Indian subcontinent. When Mughal authority began to weaken and the opportunity for territorial expansion arose, it was the English, not the Dutch, who were positioned to seize it. Its total value, what we might today call its market capitalization, has been estimated at around 78 million guilders, which, adjusted for economic scale, some historians have placed as the equivalent of somewhere between $7 and $8 trillion in modern terms. This would make it the most valuable company ever to have existed, by a considerable margin. These calculations are inherently uncertain, and historians argue about the methodology, but whatever the exact number, the point is clear. The VOC in its prime was something that the modern world has no equivalent for. It was a private company that owned factories, armies, fleets, territories, and, in some meaningful sense, entire peoples. But the system contained within it the seeds of its own destruction. The monopoly model worked beautifully, as long as it could be enforced, and enforcing it required constant military expenditure. The fortifications had to be maintained. The soldiers had to be paid. The raiding expeditions against unlicensed spice growers had to be mounted year after year. The administrative apparatus for managing far-flung territories on 3 continents had to be staffed with people who were, inevitably, some distance from home, and therefore some distance from accountability. Corruption in the VOC was not a malfunction of the system. It was, in a sense, an inherent feature of it. A Dutch factor stationed in Batavia, thousands of miles from Amsterdam, handling large quantities of valuable goods with minimal oversight, operating in a culture where personal enrichment was the explicit purpose of colonial enterprise. This was a man with extraordinary opportunities for self-dealing. The Heeren 17 were aware of this. They issued regulations against private trade by company employees. They threatened punishments. They occasionally made examples, but they could not fundamentally solve the problem, because the problem was structural. You cannot pay people modestly to manage enormous wealth in a distant and unobserved location and expect them to resist indefinitely. There was also the problem of what the Dutch were actually doing, the moral problem, which is real, but also the practical economic problem. The monopoly system in the Spice Islands was extraordinarily profitable in the short term but fundamentally static. The VOC was not developing the economies of the territories it controlled, it was extracting from them. The Banda Islands, which had been a relatively prosperous trading community before the company arrived, were, after the VOC's monopoly was established, entirely dependent on decisions made in Amsterdam. When the Heeren 17 decided to restrict production to support prices, the Purkeners starved. When the company decided to reduce purchases, the enslaved workers, who produced the nutmeg, were left with no income and no recourse. The islands were maintained in a condition of deliberate underdevelopment, prosperous enough to produce the crops the company needed, too poor and too controlled to develop any economic independence. This was not unique to the VOC. Colonial extraction of this kind was standard practice across the European empires, but the VOC pursued it with a particularly ruthless efficiency that made the long-term consequences particularly stark. And meanwhile, on the other side of Asia, the English East India Company was doing something rather different, something that would, in the long run, produce a different and even more catastrophic form of power. The India that the English East India Company encountered in the early 17th century was, in almost every dimension, more impressive than England. This is not a romantic claim. It is simply true. The Mughal Empire at its height under Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb was one of the largest and wealthiest political entities on earth. Its revenues, as calculated by the historian Shireen Musfi from Mughal administrative records, were somewhere around 400 million rupees per year in the early 17th century, a figure that dwarfs the revenues of any European state of the period. Its cities, Agra, Delhi, Lahore, Fatehpur Sikri, were among the most populous in the world. Its artisans produced cotton textiles of a quality and variety that Europe could not match. Its administrative system, the Mansabdari, was a remarkably sophisticated method of organizing a vast bureaucracy and military across a diverse subcontinent. The English merchants who arrived at Surat in the first decades of the 17th century were acutely aware of this disproportion. They were, in the most literal sense, supplicants. They wrote letters to the Mughal emperor that were deferential to the point of servility. They brought gifts, English broadcloth, which was not particularly desired in the tropics, and silver, which was always welcome. They waited for months for audiences. They argued with customs officials and port authorities. They navigated a commercial world whose rules were made by others, and whose complexity they were only beginning to understand. What they found at Surat, and gradually across the Indian coastal cities where they established factories, was a commercial ecosystem of extraordinary richness. Indian merchants, Banyans in Gujarat, Chettiars in the south, Marwaris from Rajasthan, were some of the most sophisticated traders in the world. They had credit networks, insurance systems, and financial instruments that in some cases predated anything equivalent in Europe. The hundis, bills of exchange used by Indian merchants, functioned as a kind of private banking system of remarkable scope and reliability. The EIC could not have operated in India at all without partnering with these merchants, and the partnerships it formed in its early decades were genuine, relationships of commercial interdependence in which both parties had something to offer. The EIC's primary export from India in its first century of operations was textiles. Indian cotton cloth, calico, muslin, chintz, gingham became a sensation in European markets. The patterns were colourful, the weaving was fine, and the prices were competitive enough to undercut English domestic producers. The demand was enormous. By the middle of the 17th century, cloth constituted the large majority of the EIC's exports from India, and this trade was transforming the company from a luxury spice business into something more like a mass-market textile importer. This had profound consequences for England. The English wool and linen industries lobbied frantically against the import of Indian cotton, arguing that it was destroying domestic employment. In 1690 and again in 1720, Parliament passed acts restricting or banning the import of Indian printed cotton into England, acts that were partly effective and that created a bizarre situation in which the EIC was permitted to import plain cotton cloth for re-export to other countries, but not to sell the most popular goods in its English home market. It also had profound consequences for India. As the EIC's demand for Indian textiles grew, the company developed closer relationships with the artisans who produced them. The weavers of Dhaka, famous for their muslin so fine it was called woven air, the calico printers of the Coromandel coast, the silk weavers of Bengal. These relationships were increasingly organised on the company's terms. The EIC provided advances to weavers at the beginning of a production season, binding them to deliver a specific quantity of cloth at a fixed price, and used its political influence to prevent weavers from selling to other buyers. This putting out system gave the company a reliable supply at controlled prices, but it also made the weavers economically dependent on a single buyer, whose power to dictate terms would only grow. The middle decades of the 17th century were a time of increasing difficulty for the Mughal Empire. The reign of Aurangzeb, which began in 1658 and lasted until 1707, was marked by an aggressive religious policy that alienated many of the Hindu and Sikh communities that had been integral to Mughal governance and military power, and by a catastrophically expensive and ultimately unsuccessful campaign to subjugate the Maratha Confederacy in the Deccan. By the time Aurangzeb died in 1707, the empire had been stretched to its territorial maximum, but had also been hollowed out. Its finances depleted, its administration strained, its provincial governors beginning to assert increasing independence. The Maratha Confederacy that had so exhausted Aurangzeb deserves a moment of attention, because it is one of the most remarkable political phenomena of the early modern period, and one whose significance is often overlooked in Western accounts of Indian history that focus too narrowly on the Mughal-European axis. Shivaji Bhonsle, who founded the Maratha kingdom in the 1640s and 1650s, was a military genius of the first order, a man who developed a style of guerrilla warfare perfectly suited to the Deccan Plateau, with its mountains and valleys and restricted roads, and who used it to carve out a state from the eastern edge of the Mughal Empire with a combination of military brilliance, administrative acumen, and a talent for political symbolism that was extraordinary. He was crowned Chhatrapati, Lord of the Universe, in 1674 in a ceremony of tremendous elaborateness that announced to the world that a new Hindu sovereign power had come into existence in the heart of what had been Mughal territory. After Shivaji's death in 1680, the Maratha polity evolved into a confederacy led by the Peshwas, hereditary prime ministers based at Pune, and encompassing a range of affiliated kingdoms and chiefdoms across the Deccan. At its greatest extent, the Maratha Confederacy controlled territory from the Bay of Bengal to the Arabian Sea and from the Deccan Plateau to the foothills of the Himalayas. It was, in the 18th century, the dominant military power in India, more capable, more geographically extensive, and more administratively sophisticated than any of the successor states that emerged from Mughal collapse. The EIC's confrontation with the Marathas was one of the defining contests of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, and it required the company to develop military capabilities on a scale that its founders would not have recognised. 3 Anglo-Maratha wars, in 1775 to 1782, 1803 to 1805, and 1817 to 1819, were required before the Maratha Confederacy was finally broken. These were not minor colonial skirmishes, they were full-scale wars against a military power that had defeated Mughal armies, that operated sophisticated artillery, and that employed European military advisors, including some who had served in the armies of Napoleon. The Second Anglo-Maratha War, in particular, was a conflict of considerable strategic complexity, in which Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, commanded EEC forces and learned many of the lessons in logistics, intelligence, and coalition warfare that would serve him in Europe. Wellington's Indian experience is one of history's underappreciated connections. The general who defeated Napoleon had been formed, in his essential military identity, by fighting the Marathas and Tipu Sultan in India under the EIC's flag. The tactics he developed for moving armies across a vast and poorly mapped subcontinent, for managing supply chains in hostile territory, for using intelligence to offset numerical disadvantage, these were the tools he brought to Portugal and Spain, and ultimately to Waterloo. The EIC, in this indirect way, shaped the outcome of the Napoleonic Wars. The EIC watched this process with the same mixture of concern and opportunity that attended most political instability. The declining authority of the Mughal centre meant that the company's protection of its factories depended less on imperial goodwill and more on its own capacity for self-defence. And this in turn meant that the slow militarisation of the EIC, which had been happening in increments since the 1660s, accelerated. It was in this context that one of the most consequential figures in the EIC's history emerged. Robert Clive, called Clive of India by later admirers, arrived in India in 1743 as a clerk, a writer in the company's employment, a position that involved bookkeeping and correspondence, and offered almost no prospect of glory. He was 18 years old, depressed, frequently ill, and by his own account deeply unhappy with his assignment. He attempted suicide at least twice in his early years in India, according to accounts that may be somewhat embellished but which suggest a young man under serious psychological strain. What saved Clive, in a sense, was war. The War of the Austrian Succession, which was primarily a European conflict, had its echoes in India through the proxy competition between the EIC and the French Compagnie des Indes, the French version of an East India Company which had established its own factories on the Indian coast and was competing with the English for the trade and the political favour of Indian rulers. When fighting broke out between the two companies at Madras in the 1740s, Clive discovered what he had been unable to find at a writing desk. He was a natural soldier, possessed of a physical courage and tactical instinct that were remarkable even by the standards of an era that admired military boldness. By 1751, Clive was leading an EIC force that seized and held the fortress of Arcot against a French allied army many times its size, a feat of arms that made him famous both in India and in England. By 1756, he was 31 years old, had returned to England, entered Parliament, and was considered one of the most important men in the EIC's service. When news reached London that the Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had seized the EIC's fortified base at Calcutta and committed the atrocity, real or exaggerated, that became known as the Black Hole of Calcutta, Clive was sent back to India with a force to restore the situation. What followed was not, in military terms, a great battle, but it was one of the most consequential confrontations in modern history. The plain of Plassey, in Bengali, Palashi, lies along the Bhagirathi River in Bengal, about 90 miles north of Calcutta. It is flat, low-lying land, subject to the flooding of the monsoon season, fringed with mango groves. On June 23, 1757, Robert Clive positioned his army of about 3,000 men, roughly 800 Europeans and 2,200 Indian sepoys, soldiers trained and equipped in the European fashion, against the forces of Siraj ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal. The Nawab's army numbered somewhere between 50 and 60,000, depending on the source. It included cavalry, infantry, war elephants, and a formidable artillery park directed by French gunners. By any rational calculation of military force, the outcome should not have been in doubt. But the battle was not really a battle. It was a conspiracy. In the weeks before Plassey, Clive had been conducting a complex negotiation with Mir Jafar, one of the Nawab's senior commanders and a man with his own ambitions to replace Siraj ud-Dowlah. Jafar had agreed to betray the Nawab during the battle, to hold his large division of cavalry inactive at the crucial moment, allowing the English to prevail. In exchange, Mir Jafar would be installed as the new Nawab of Bengal, and he would pay the EIC an enormous sum in compensation for the seizure of Calcutta and other expenses. The battle itself lasted only a few hours. When the rains came, the Nawab's unprotected artillery was rendered largely ineffective. The wet powder could not fire. The EIC's artillery, which had been protected under tarpaulins, continued to operate. Mir Jafar's cavalry stood aside. The Nawab's forces, confused and leaderless, began to withdraw. Siraj ud-Dowlah fled, was captured by one of Mir Jafar's sons, and was murdered. Mir Jafar entered Calcutta as the new Nawab of Bengal, and Robert Clive presented his bill. The bill was extraordinary. The EIC received approximately 10 million rupees. The individual members of Clive's council received payments ranging from several hundred thousand to several million rupees. Clive himself, who was scrupulous enough to refuse many of the gifts that were pressed upon him during the chaotic aftermath of Plassey, nonetheless received somewhere between 2.5 million and 3 million rupees as a personal payment from Mir Jafar, a sum that made him, at age 32, one of the wealthiest men in England. He justified this to a parliamentary inquiry later in his life with a phrase that has become famous. "When I consider what I might have taken, I am astonished at my own moderation." It is not entirely clear whether this was genuine, ironically self-aware, or simply a statement of fact. The sums available to him were so large that what he actually took was indeed modest by comparison. But Plassey was not simply a very profitable battle. It was the moment that transformed the EIC from a trading company into a territorial power. Mir Jafar was Nawab, but he was Nawab at the pleasure of the EIC, whose financial demands, increasingly urgent, increasingly large, he struggled to meet. When he could not, the EIC replaced him with another candidate. Bengal's politics became, in effect, EIC politics. The company's army, expanding rapidly now, paid for by Bengal's revenues, could install and remove Nawabs at will. The subcontinent's second richest province was, in practice if not in name, under English control. The transformation was formalised in 1765, when the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, at this point a figure of theoretical sovereignty with very little actual power, granted the EIC the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. The Diwani was the right to collect the revenues of these provinces. It was, in the language of Mughal administration, an administrative office, a recognition that the company would serve as the emperor's revenue agent in these territories. In the language of reality, it was an acknowledgement that the EIC now controlled provinces, containing roughly 30 million people, and that their taxes would flow to the company's treasury. Clive, receiving the news of this grant, described it as an acquisition which, under the circumstances, I may be permitted to call stupendous. He was not wrong. The annual revenues of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa were in the range of 2 to 3 million pounds sterling per year, a sum that dwarfed the EIC's entire capital, and that was immediately redirected toward financing further military expansion rather than toward any development of the territories from which it was taken. This was the beginning of what the historian William Dalrymple and others have described as one of the most devastating acts of organised looting in human history. The revenues of Bengal were collected with a rigour that the Nawab's administration, whatever its faults, had never quite achieved, and they were collected in the aftermath of a catastrophic famine. In 1769 and 1770, the Great Bengal Famine killed somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of the population of Bengal, between 5 and 10 million people, by various estimates. The famine was caused by a drought, but it was exacerbated catastrophically by EIC revenue policy. The company continued to raise revenue demands even as the population was dying, and it restricted private trade in grain in ways that prevented the natural market responses that might have mitigated the disaster. The directors of the EIC in London received news of this famine with concern, primarily with concern about its impact on future revenue collections. A dead peasant cannot pay taxes. The humanitarian dimension was not entirely absent from the company's correspondence. There were men in the EIC who were genuinely troubled by what was happening in Bengal, but the institutional response was determined primarily by financial calculation, and the financial calculation was that the famine, while unfortunate, did not fundamentally alter the revenue model. The Bengal famine of 1770 remains one of the most terrible events in the history of colonial rule, and it casts a long shadow over any assessment of the EIC's period of governance. The accounts left by those who witnessed it, EC employees, Indian officials, the few Indian writers who documented the period, describe a landscape of almost incomprehensible suffering. The rivers were clogged with corpses, entire villages were abandoned. The rich farmland of Bengal, which had been producing some of the most abundant agricultural yields in Asia, lay unworked because there was no one left to till it. Children begged in city streets until they were too weak to beg. Mothers tried to sell their children for food and found no buyers. And yet the EIC's revenue collectors, following their instructions, continued to demand the annual revenue assessment. The zamindars, the revenue intermediaries who stood between the company and the actual cultivators of the land, were themselves under pressure to deliver the assessment, and they applied that pressure downward onto people who had nothing. The revenue collected in the years immediately after the famine was, in some districts, actually higher than in the years before it, because the population had been reduced and the surviving cultivators were forced to work a larger area, and because the company raised the rate to compensate for the smaller number of payers. The famine was not the last. The history of the EICs and then the British government's management of India is punctuated by famines of catastrophic scale. In Madras in 1782, in Bengal again in 1783, in Deccan in 1803, in Orissa in 1866, in Bihar in 1873, in Madras and Bombay in 1876 to 1879, in Deccan again in 1896 to 1897, in Bengal again in 1943. The historian Mike Davis, in his work on the great famines of the colonial era, argues that these were not primarily natural disasters, but political ones, that the combination of colonial, revenue policy, the disruption of traditional food distribution systems, and the application of laissez-faire economic ideology to a population with no ability to withstand market shocks, produced death tolls that were not inevitable consequences of drought, but consequences of governance choices. This argument is, like all arguments about counterfactual history, contested. But the scale of the human catastrophe is not contested. The various famines of British India, from the EIC period through the Raj, killed tens of millions of people. The 1943 Bengal famine alone, which occurred not during the EIC period, but during the Second World War, under Churchill's government, killed somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, and was exacerbated by wartime export policies and a refusal to declare an official famine, which would have triggered relief measures, until the death toll had already become catastrophic. The EIC was now something that the world had not seen before, a private company governing a subcontinent. It had its own army, which would eventually reach 200,000 soldiers, the largest standing army on the Indian subcontinent and one of the largest in the world. It had its own civil service, which administered justice, collected taxes, built roads, managed the postal system and regulated commerce across territories encompassing hundreds of millions of people. The civil service of the EIC, known as the Covenanted Civil Service, later the Indian Civil Service, was a remarkable institution in its own right. Entry was, in the early period, through patronage. A director of the company had the right to nominate young men to the college at Haileybury, where they received 2 years of training in Indian languages, history and law before being sent out. The patronage system meant that a director's ability to place a young relative, or the son of a friend in the service, was one of the most valuable perquisites of being on the EIC's board, and it produced a civil service that was, in its early decades, composed largely of men whose principal qualification was that they knew someone on the court of directors. The system improved after 1853, when competitive examination replaced patronage, a reform that produced a considerably more meritocratic civil service, though one whose examinations were designed around classical Greek and Latin literature in a way that effectively limited candidacy to graduates of Oxford and Cambridge, which in turn limited it effectively to the English upper and professional classes. Indian candidates were technically eligible for the civil service examinations from 1858 but faced formidable practical obstacles. The examinations were held only in London, the preparation required was available only at English schools, and the age limits were set at levels that were difficult for Indians to meet given the time needed to travel to England. The first Indian to qualify, Satyendranath Tagore, elder brother of the poet Rabindranath Tagore, did so in 1863, 15 years after competitive examination was introduced. The EC's legal system in India was similarly a complex overlay of English common law onto existing Indian legal traditions. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General, had attempted to codify Hindu and Muslim personal law in ways that would make it administrable by English-trained judges, a project that required translating Sanskrit texts on Dharmashastra and Arabic texts on fiqh into English, and that in the process inevitably simplified and systematized legal traditions that had never been as fixed or as uniform as the codification project assumed. The consequences of this simplification, the freezing of custom at a particular historical moment, the selection of texts that the colonial scholars happened to find authoritative, rather than texts that were actually most widely followed, were felt in Indian family law for generations, and some of their effects persist to the present day. It had its own army, which would eventually reach 200,000 soldiers, the largest standing army on the Indian subcontinent, and one of the largest in the world. It had its own civil service, which administered justice, collected taxes, built roads, managed the postal system, and regulated commerce across territories encompassing hundreds of millions of people. It had its own foreign policy, negotiating treaties with Indian princes through a system of residence, EIC political officers attached to the courts of Indian rulers who used their position to accumulate influence and ultimately to annex territory when the opportunity arose. The doctrine that eventually formalized this process of annexation was called the Doctrine of Lapse, associated with the Governor-General Lord Dalhousie in the 1840s and 1850s, and it held that when an Indian ruler died without a natural heir, his territory lapsed to the company, preventing the traditional Indian practice of adopting an heir. Through this and other mechanisms of political pressure, the EIC steadily absorbed princely states across the subcontinent. Sindh was annexed in 1843, Punjab in 1849, Awadh in 1856. The contrast with the VOC at this stage of history is striking. The VOC had been organised around monopoly extraction from a relatively small number of high-value products in a geographically compact archipelago. Its territorial power was real but essentially defensive, protecting the sources of its spice monopoly rather than building a vast administrative structure. The EIC, by contrast, had been forced by circumstances, the Amboyna Massacre, the complexity of Indian politics, the collapse of Mughal authority, into something far more ambitious. It was governing a subcontinent, it was building a state, and the state it was building was organised not around the provision of public goods or the welfare of the governed, but around the extraction of revenue in quantities that would flow to shareholders in London who had never set foot in India and never would. The EIC's parliamentary charter required renewal periodically, and each renewal was an occasion for debate in the English Parliament about what exactly this company was and what it should be permitted to do. The debates were remarkably frank by the standards of the era. Edmund Burke, who led the effort to impeach Warren Hastings, the EIC's first Governor-General, delivered some of the most eloquent denunciations of corporate power in the English language, arguing that the EIC had turned a trading licence into a mandate for oppression on a continental scale, and that the English nation was morally responsible for what was being done in its name by this private institution. Burke failed to convict Hastings. The trial lasted 7 years and ended in acquittal, but he succeeded in establishing something important in the public consciousness of England, that the EIC's power was a problem, and that it could not simply continue indefinitely without some form of accountability. The India Act of 1784 created a Board of Control, a government body with the power to supervise and override the EIC's directors on political matters, reducing the company's autonomy without abolishing it. It was the beginning of a process of creeping nationalisation that would eventually, after one more great catastrophe, conclude the EIC's existence entirely. While the EIC was building its Indian empire through the middle decades of the 18th century, the VOC was dying. The process was slow, painful, and extensively documented. The Dutch archives are meticulous, and it illustrates with unusual clarity the pathologies of an extractive monopoly that has begun to encounter the limits of its model. The first signs of serious trouble appeared in the 1670s, ironically during the period of highest dividend payments. The problem was not income. The spice trade continued to generate enormous revenues, but rather the structure of those revenues and the mounting costs against which they had to be measured. The English had fought 3 naval wars against the Dutch between 1652 and 1674, and these conflicts, while not directly ruinous to the VOC, had strained Dutch naval power and contributed to a general sense of military overextension. Louis XIV of France invaded the Dutch Republic in 1672, the Rampjaar, or disaster year, and, while the Republic survived through the heroic measure of opening the dikes and flooding the countryside, the crisis consumed enormous national resources. The VOC's costs were also rising steadily, for reasons internal to its own operations. The monopoly system required constant military enforcement, and the territories where that enforcement was needed were expanding. The company's armies in Asia were growing. The maintenance of fortifications from Cape Town to Dashima consumed resources that the spice trade revenues had to cover. The administrative apparatus, the thousands of clerks, factors, and officials who managed the company's affairs across 3 continents, had to be paid. And then there was corruption. The problem of employee self-dealing had always been present in the VOC, but in the company's early decades, when the revenues were spectacular and the oversight from Amsterdam relatively effective, it had been containable. By the early 18th century it had become systemic. The VOC's acronym was resignedly translated by contemporaries as Vergen onder corruptie, perished by corruption, and while this is certainly unfair as a complete explanation, it captures something real about the institutional decay that had set in. The problem was structural, as it had always been structural. A company employee stationed in Batavia or Nagasaki or Ceylon, handling large quantities of goods and cash, with months of sailing time between himself and his superiors in Amsterdam, had every incentive to conduct private trade on the side, buying goods cheaply in one Asian port and selling them expensively in another, pocketing the difference rather than adding it to the company's accounts. The Heeren 17th prohibited this repeatedly and severely. They prescribed punishments. They conducted investigations. The practice continued because the temptations were so large and the opportunities for discovery so limited. The VOC also faced an external challenge that its monopoly model was poorly equipped to handle: the gradual development of substitute goods that reduced the value of its spice monopoly. European botanists had been attempting for decades to transplant spice trees from their home islands to other tropical locations where the VOC could not control them. The company was aware of these attempts and went to considerable lengths to prevent them, including the practice of boiling or burning nutmeg before export to prevent the seeds from germinating. But in 1770, a French botanist named Pierre Poivre, whose name delightfully means pepper in French, succeeded in smuggling nutmeg and clove seedlings from the Banda Islands to the French colony of Mauritius. The monopoly was broken. Within decades, cloves and nutmeg were growing in the French Caribbean, in Zanzibar, in Sri Lanka, in places where the VOC had no power to restrict them. The price of these spices, already declining as coffee and tea became the luxury commodities of choice in European markets, fell further. The extraordinary profit margins that had made the Banda Massacre economically rational by the VOC's calculus evaporated. By the middle of the 18th century, the VOC was borrowing heavily to maintain its dividend payments, a practice that is the corporate equivalent of eating your own seed corn. The Heeren 17 were aware that the company's finances were deteriorating, but they faced a political problem. The moment they cut dividends, the share price would fall, and the institutional prestige of the VOC, which was bound up with those dividends in the minds of Dutch investors, would be damaged. So they borrowed, and borrowed, and borrowed again. The debts accumulated steadily across the second half of the 18th century. By 1780, the VOC owed approximately 74 million guilders, a sum that its revenues, even had they been properly managed, could not service. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War of 1780 to 1784, which ended in a significant defeat for the Dutch, made the situation dramatically worse. British naval power disrupted the VOC's shipping lanes, captured several of its most important trading posts, and demonstrated that the military power that had underpinned the monopoly for a century and a half was no longer adequate to protect it. The man who most clearly diagnosed the VOC's condition in its final years was a retired company official named Dirk van Hogendorp, who wrote a series of increasingly alarmed memoranda to the Dutch government in the 1790s, warning that the company was bankrupt and that the colonial system it had built was morally and economically indefensible. Van Hogendorp's analysis was accurate, and it was ignored, as accurate but inconvenient analyses so often are. The final blow came from Europe rather than Asia. In 1795, French revolutionary armies invaded the Dutch Republic and established the Batavian Republic, a client state of France. The old Dutch Republic, with its merchant oligarchs and its VOC shareholders, was gone. The new government did not share the old regime's attachment to the company, and the company's debts were by now so large that there was no realistic prospect of repayment. The dissolution of the VOC was not a sudden event, but a slow unwinding that had been anticipated for years. As early as the 1780s, the company's condition was common knowledge among the Dutch financial community. The shares, which had traded at 18,000 guilders in the 1670s, had fallen to a fraction of that value, and the dividends that had once been the envy of Europe were being paid largely from borrowed capital rather than actual profits. The men who continued to buy VOC shares in this period were, in the judgment of later economists, either optimists of extraordinary resilience or gamblers who had calculated that the Dutch state would ultimately backstop the company's debts rather than allow the institution to fail completely. They were half right. The state did absorb the debts, but it also absorbed nothing else, because by the time the Batavian Republic took over, the assets of the VOC were considerably less valuable than they had been. The fortified posts in Asia were expensive to maintain. The trading network, disrupted by the Anglo-Dutch Wars, was a shadow of its former self. The spice monopoly had been broken by the successful transplantation of clove and nutmeg trees to other tropical locations. What remained was a colonial infrastructure, a set of territories in what is now Indonesia, that would have to be governed and defended by a Dutch state whose resources were, in the wake of the French revolutionary upheaval, stretched to their limit. The last years of the VOC saw some of its most melancholy episodes. Trading posts that had operated for a century were quietly abandoned because the company could no longer afford to staff them. Factors in remote corners of the Asian network, on the Persian Gulf, in Bengal, in Siam, found themselves cut off from support, their communications unreliable, their instructions months out of date, their salaries unpaid. Some simply adapted as best they could, conducting private trade on their own account in the interstices of the company's declining structure. Others simply went home, if they could find a way. The Dutch colony of the Cape of Good Hope, established in 1652 as a way station for VOC ships rounding the southern tip of Africa, and developed over a century and a half into a genuine colonial settlement with a substantial European population, was captured by the British in 1806 and retained under the terms of the 1814 Congress of Vienna. The Afrikaner population that the VOC had created there, the descendants of Dutch settlers, German immigrants, and French Huguenots who had arrived in successive waves over 150 years, would eventually produce the Boer republics and ultimately the apartheid state of South Africa. This too is part of the VOC's legacy, a population and a racial ideology implanted in southern Africa whose consequences extended into the 20th century. The Ceylon operations, which the VOC had developed into one of its most profitable Asian possessions, controlling the cinnamon trade from this large island off the southern tip of India, also fell to the British, first occupied in 1796 and formally ceded in 1815. The cinnamon gardens of Ceylon, which the VOC had managed with the same monopolistic rigour it applied to nutmeg and cloves, passed into British hands along with the extensive administrative apparatus the Dutch had constructed to govern the island. On December 31st, 1799, the VOC's charter expired and was not renewed. The company was dissolved. Its assets, the fortresses, the territories, the warehouses, the fleets, the debts of 140 million guilders were transferred to the Batavian Republic, and through it to the French Empire under Napoleon. The world's most powerful trading company had ceased to exist. It had lasted almost exactly 2 centuries. The territories of the former VOC in Asia, the Indonesian archipelago, passed through French hands and then, after Napoleon's defeat, to the newly formed Kingdom of the Netherlands in 1815. The Dutch retained control of what is now Indonesia until after the Second World War, when a long and bloody independence struggle resulted in the Indonesian Declaration of Independence in 1945 and Dutch recognition in 1949. The colonial infrastructure built by Pieterszoon Coen and the Heeren 17 thus outlasted the company by a century and a half, maintained, exploited, and then lost by the Dutch state that inherited it. The human costs of the VOC's century and a half of rule in Asia are difficult to quantify and impossible to fully comprehend. The Banda Islands massacre of 1621 eliminated a people. The forced cultivation systems in Java and the Malukus kept millions in conditions of controlled poverty. The disruption of existing Asian trade networks, the Arab merchants, the Malay traders, the Chinese junks that had moved through the waters of the Indonesian archipelago for centuries, had consequences that rippled across generations, and the debt of 140 million guilders that the company left behind was a weight that the Dutch state carried for years, a financial legacy as concrete as any the company had produced in its heyday. The English East India Company did not die in the elegant bankruptcy that claimed the VOC. It died in fire, in the bloodiest, most traumatic event in the entire history of British India, an event that shook the foundations of the relationship between England and the subcontinent it had spent 2 centuries colonising. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, called the Sepoy Mutiny by the British, called the First War of Independence by later Indian nationalists, and understood by historians as something more complex and more human than either label allows, began in May of that year at a military cantonment called Meerut, about 40 miles northeast of Delhi. The immediate trigger was a story about cartridges. The EIC had introduced a new rifle, the Enfield Pattern 1853, which used paper cartridges that had to be bitten open before loading. A rumour spread through the Sepoy ranks, the Indian soldiers who made up the bulk of the EEC's enormous army, that the cartridge paper was greased with a mixture of pig and cow fat, which was offensive to both Muslim and Hindu religious prohibitions. The rumour may or may not have been accurate, but it landed in a context already saturated with grievances. Those grievances were real and various. The doctrine of lapse had dispossessed the rulers of several significant Indian states, and the courtiers and soldiers who had served those rulers now found themselves unemployed and resentful. The annexation of Awadh in 1856 had removed the most culturally prestigious of the remaining Muslim princely states. EIC revenue. Policy had impoverished countless farmers. Missionary activity, which the company had long tried to discourage for commercial reasons, had been permitted to expand, raising fears of forced conversion. The promotion of Indian officers in the army was blocked at low ranks, regardless of competence, by racial policies that the sepoys experienced as a humiliation. On May 10th, 1857, the sepoys at Meerut rose, killed their British officers, freed their imprisoned comrades, and marched through the night to Delhi. There they found the aged Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, last of a dynasty, a poet and a prisoner in his own palace, and they declared him their leader. What had begun as a local mutiny became, within weeks, a rebellion spanning much of northern India. The violence on both sides was extreme. The British suffered some genuine massacres, including the killing of European civilians at Cawnpore, an event that the British press reported in terms of maximum horror and that generated a fury in England that overwhelmed any rational discussion of cause and effect. The British reprisals were, in the judgment of later historians, at least as brutal and considerably more systematic. Captured rebels were blown from the muzzles of artillery, a method of execution chosen specifically to violate Hindu and Muslim religious concepts of the body. Entire villages were burned. Summary executions proceeded by the hundreds. The rebellion was suppressed by the end of 1858, with the last significant resistance crushed and Bahadur Shah Zafar exiled to Rangoon, where he died in 1862. But the political consequences were immediate and irreversible. In August 1858, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, which transferred all of the EIC's territories, armies, revenues, and administrative functions to the British Crown. The company, stripped of its Indian empire, lingered briefly as a holder of the training establishment at Haileybury, the school where its civil servants had been educated, before being formally dissolved on June 1, 1874. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1877, a title that would have seemed inconceivable to the merchants who gathered in Founders Hall in the City of London on September 24, 1599, to sign the petition requesting the charter that became the East India Company. The British Raj, the direct rule of India by the British Crown, would last until 1947, when Indian independence was achieved after a long nationalist movement and the enormous disruption of the Second World War. The partition of British India into India and Pakistan was accompanied by some of the worst communal violence in modern history, with between 200,000 and 2 million dead in the massacres that attended the movement of millions of people across new borders, drawn by a British civil servant, Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who had never previously been to India. The EIC's legacy in India is, like the VOC's legacy in Indonesia, one of the most contested questions in modern historical and political debate. The company's defenders, and they existed then as they exist now, argued that it built railways, legal codes, universities, and a civil service, that it abolished sati, the practice of widow immolation, that it created the administrative infrastructure on which modern India was built, and that the unity it imposed on a politically fragmented subcontinent was a precondition for the national identity that eventually drove the independence movement. These arguments are not entirely without merit, and some of them are made by Indian historians as well as British ones. The company's critics, and they are more numerous, and backed by more evidence, point to the deliberate deindustrialization of Indian craft industries, particularly textiles, as the EIC and then the British government used their political power to favour Lancashire cotton mills over Indian hand weavers, to the revenue policies that contributed to a series of devastating famines across the 19th century, to the systematic exclusion of Indians from positions of authority in the government of their own country, and to the fundamental violence of the project, the idea that one people had the right to govern another without consent and for profit. The British economist Utsa Patnaik has attempted to quantify what the EIC and its successor extracted from India across 2 centuries of colonial rule, arriving at an estimate in the range of $45 trillion in modern values, a figure that is contested by some economists, but which, in its general direction, if not its precise magnitude, is supported by a wide range of historical evidence. India's share of the global economy declined from roughly 24% at the beginning of the colonial period to roughly 4% at the time of independence. The world's most sophisticated textile industry was supplanted by imports from Lancashire. The handloom weavers of Dhaka, whose muslin had been prized at courts from Versailles to Agra, largely ceased to practice their craft within a generation of the EIC's consolidation of power in Bengal. We have travelled a long distance tonight, from the spice markets of 15th century Venice to the plains of Plassey, from the volcanic shores of the Banda Islands to the streets of Delhi in 1857. We have followed 2 companies from their origins as commercial ventures, through their transformation into something that defied easy categorization, and on to their eventual dissolution. And now we arrive at the question that brought us here. Which was more powerful, the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company? The answer requires us to first agree on what we mean by power, because the 2 companies were powerful in different ways, at different times, and over different scales. Let us work through this methodically, considering 6 distinct dimensions of power. The first dimension is financial power and return on investment. By this measure, the VOC wins the early contest decisively. The company's peak dividends, sometimes exceeding 60% annually, represented a return on investment that no subsequent financial institution has come close to replicating in a sustained way. The estimated peak market capitalization of the VOC has been calculated, using various methodologies, as equivalent to somewhere between $4 and $8 trillion in today's values, depending on the conversion method used. The EIC was never close to this in its trading phase. It was a profitable company, certainly, but not in the same stratospheric league as the VOC at its 17th century peak. However, and this is important, the VOC's extraordinary financial returns were also ultimately a sign of its fragility. A system that generates returns of 60% annually is, almost by definition, extracting value faster than it can be replaced. The Banda Nutmeg Islands were profitable because the VOC had eliminated competition, enslaved the labour force, and controlled every element of the supply chain. When the monopoly broke, when the prices fell, when the enforcement cost became prohibitive, there was nothing underneath the profits. No developed economy, no loyal trading partners, no diversified business to sustain the enterprise. The EIC, by contrast, built something more durable if considerably less spectacular. Its profits from India were enormous, but they were derived from governance as much as from trade, from the collection of taxes, from the control of commerce across a vast and complex economy, from the rents on land and the revenues of courts. This kind of income, while morally far more troubling than the VOC's spice monopoly, was also more self-renewing. A taxed economy continues to produce revenue. A monopoly on a tropical spice does not. The second dimension is territorial extent and governance. Here, the contrast is stark. The VOC controlled, at its height, a network of fortified trading posts, factories and plantations spread across the Indian Ocean world, remarkable in its scope and sophistication, but thin in terms of population and economic complexity. The VOC's territorial rule was intense in the Spice Islands and parts of Java, but it was never an empire in the sense of governing a large, complex, diversified population. Even its most direct territorial possession, the island of Java, was governed largely through existing Javanese political structures, with the VOC extracting tribute and monopoly rights, rather than administering every village. The EIC, by the mid-19th century, was governing an estimated 200 million people, roughly a quarter of the world's population at that time. It administered courts, collected taxes, built infrastructure, regulated commerce, and maintained law and order across a territory that stretched from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean, from the Indus to the Ganges Delta. This was not simply trade, it was empire in the fullest sense of the word, the actual administration of a civilization. No private company in the history of the world has ever done anything remotely comparable. The VOC's territorial control, impressive as it was, involved perhaps 2 or 3 million people at its direct peak. The EIC's involved 200 million. By the measure of territorial scope and population governed, the EIC wins without contest and wins by an order of magnitude. The third dimension is military power. Both companies maintained armies and navies that were formidable by the standards of their era. The VOC's navy, at its 17th century peak, was larger than that of most European states. The Dutch Republic was, after all, one of the great maritime powers of the era, and the VOC was the core of that maritime power. The company's fleet of around 150 to 200 ships, armed with heavy artillery, was sufficient to defeat the Portuguese, to keep the English at bay in the Spice Islands, and to enforce the monopoly across the Indian Ocean. But the EIC's army, by the mid-19th century, numbered around 200,000 soldiers, a figure that makes it one of the largest standing armies on Earth at that time, larger than the British Army proper, and larger than the armies of most European powers. This army was organised, drilled, and equipped on European lines, and it had proved itself capable of defeating every military force it had encountered on the Indian subcontinent. It had fought the Marathas, the Sikhs, the Gurkhas, the Tipu Sultan of Mysore, adversaries of very considerable military quality, and had prevailed against all of them. Military power in the 19th century is also different from military power in the 17th century. The Industrial Revolution was underway, and the gap between European and non-European military technology was widening rapidly. The EIC's army benefited from the most advanced weapons technology in the world. The VOC's army, while effective in the 17th century context, was operating in an era of greater military parity between European and Asian powers. On balance, the EIC's military at its peak was probably the more impressive institution, simply by virtue of its scale. The fourth dimension is longevity and institutional resilience. The VOC lasted from 1602 to 1799, almost exactly 197 years. It went bankrupt and was dissolved, leaving debts of 140 million guilders. The EIC lasted from 1600 to 1874, 274 years, the longest period of corporate rule over a major territory in human history. It was dissolved by the British government, not by bankruptcy, and its dissolution was essentially a nationalisation rather than a failure. By this measure, the EIC demonstrates greater institutional resilience, though we should note that the EIC's ability to call on the British state when in difficulty was a crucial advantage that the VOC, operating in a smaller and more commercially oriented state, did not have to the same degree. The fifth dimension is cultural and economic legacy. The VOC's legacy is visible in the Netherlands' continued relationship with Indonesia, in the Dutch language spoken by certain Indonesian communities, in the legal codes that shaped Indonesian governance during the colonial period, in the architectural heritage of Batavia, now Jakarta, in the economic patterns that the colonial period imposed on the archipelago. It is also visible in the Netherlands' own economic DNA, the financial innovations that the VOC pioneered. The joint stock company, the stock exchange, the tradable share, are foundational to the modern global economy. The EIC's legacy in India is more extensive and more contested. The English language, which the EIC's educational policies promoted and which became the lingua franca of Indian bureaucracy and commerce, is now spoken by somewhere between 125 and 350 million people in India, making India one of the largest English-speaking countries in the world. The Indian railways, which the British developed from the 1850s onward, are among the largest railway systems on Earth. The legal and administrative systems of modern India, the common law tradition, the civil service, the parliamentary model of governance, derive directly from the EIC period and its successor, the Raj. And the borders of modern South Asia, including the catastrophically drawn borders that produced the Kashmir conflict, are a direct consequence of EIC and British policy. The sixth dimension is the question of what each company represents as a model of power. This is perhaps the most important dimension and the most difficult to quantify. The VOC represents a certain kind of corporate power, the power of the monopoly. Its genius was in the control of supply, in the ability to manage, with military force if necessary, the conditions under which valuable goods were produced and sold, and to extract the difference between production cost and market price as profit. This model is ancient in its logic. It is essentially the logic of the toll booth elevated to a global scale, and it reached its fullest expression in the VOC's spice trade. The EIC represents a different and, in the long run, more dangerous kind of corporate power, the power of governance. Its genius was not in controlling a specific commodity, but in controlling an administrative system, the courts, the tax collectors, the army, the trade regulations, that allowed it to extract value from an entire economy. This model is not about monopoly in the traditional sense. It is about sovereignty, the power to make the rules by which everyone else plays. The EIC's model turned out to be in many ways more powerful and more durable than the VOC's, because it was less dependent on any specific product. When spice prices fell, the VOC had nothing else. When a particular sector of the Indian economy declined, the EIC had dozens of other sectors to tax. The EIC was, in effect, a state, and states have a resilience that monopolies do not. There is one further dimension worth adding, and it is perhaps the most historically consequential of all, the question of how each company shaped the institutions that outlasted it. The VOC's most enduring institutional legacy is the joint stock company and the stock market. These financial instruments, which the VOC pioneered at a scale and with a sophistication that had no precedent, are the foundational architecture of modern capitalism. Every company that lists on a stock exchange today, every corporation whose shares can be bought and sold by anyone with an internet connection and a brokerage account, is operating within an institutional framework that the Heren 17 first made workable in the courtyards of Amsterdam. The venture capital fund, the pension fund, the index fund, all of these are, in their essential logic, variations on the theme that the VOC established in 1602. The idea that capital can be assembled from many investors, deployed in long-term ventures, and returned to those investors through tradable shares was genuinely new in 1602. It is now so fundamental to economic life that we rarely pause to notice that someone invented it, and that the invention was motivated by the desire to fund a spice monopoly on the other side of the world. The EIC's most enduring institutional legacy is more diffuse and more uncomfortable. The administrative state of modern India, its civil service traditions, its legal system grounded in common law, its railway network, its postal system, its university structures, was built in its essential architecture by the EIC and its successor Raj. This is not a reason to admire the EIC. Institutions built by force and maintained through exploitation carry the marks of their origins into the present, and the administrative inheritance is no exception. But it is a reason to take the EIC seriously as a formative influence on one of the world's most populous democracies, a democracy that continues to work out, in its courts and its parliament and its academic journals, what to make of the 2 centuries during which a private trading company ran the subcontinent. The English language in India is perhaps the most vivid example of this layered legacy. The EIC's educational policy, systematised by Thomas Babington Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education in 1835, recommended English as the medium of instruction in government-supported schools, on the explicit grounds that it was superior to Sanskrit or Arabic as a vehicle for modern knowledge. The Minute is a document of breathtaking cultural arrogance, and it has been condemned on those grounds by Indian and British scholars alike for nearly 2 centuries. And yet the English language in India is now, by any measure, a resource as well as a relic of conquest. It is the medium through which India's technology industry communicates with the world, through which Indian writers reach global audiences, through which a federal democracy, with 22 official languages, maintains inter-regional coherence in its courts and administrative structures. Languages, unlike monopolies, cannot be unilaterally revoked. They take root, transform, and become native to the soil where they are planted, regardless of the conditions of their planting. So which was more powerful? If we are asking about peak financial return and the efficiency of extraction at a single moment in time, the VOC wins. No institution has ever returned money to investors at the rate the VOC did in its prime, and no institution has ever controlled a global commodity with the completeness that the VOC controlled nutmeg and cloves for most of the 17th century. If we are asking about total reach, total governance, total impact on the trajectory of human history, the EIC wins, and wins substantially. 200 million people governed, an entire subcontinent reshaped, a language imposed that is now spoken by hundreds of millions, economic patterns established that still influence the Indian economy today. The wealth extracted from India across 2 centuries that financed in part the Industrial Revolution in England. The Bengal famines, the deindustrialization of Indian textiles, the partition of the subcontinent, the consequences of EIC rule ramify through history in ways that the VOC's consequences, devastating as they were, do not match in sheer scale. The VOC was, in the language of our moment, the higher valuation startup. Spectacular returns, focused model, brilliant innovation, early exit. The EIC was the longer-lasting, larger-scale, slower-burning institution, less spectacular at any single moment, but more deeply embedded in the world it touched, and therefore more consequential in its ultimate effects. Both companies were, by any moral standard, monstrous in significant dimensions of their operation. Both used violence, enslavement, and political manipulation on a scale that makes the word trading company feel almost comically inadequate. Both destroyed communities, disrupted civilizations, and extracted wealth from millions of people who received nothing, or worse than nothing, in return. And yet both companies also demonstrated something that the architects of our modern world absorbed, sometimes consciously and sometimes not, that commerce and governance are not separable, that the private accumulation of capital is not politically neutral, and that institutions given enough power, given armies, given courts, given the ability to tax, will inevitably become political actors regardless of what their charters say. The VOC and the EIC were the first and most extreme demonstrations of a truth that the modern world continues to grapple with, that corporate power, left unchecked, does not stop at commerce. It reaches for sovereignty. It reaches for the ability to make the rules rather than simply to play by them. And when it reaches far enough, it becomes indistinguishable from empire. The modern multinational corporation, with its tax optimization across jurisdictions, its private arbitration clauses that place disputes outside the reach of national courts, its ability to move capital faster than any government can track, its infrastructure in some cases larger than the states it operates within, is, in its deepest logic, a descendant of these 2 companies. The lineage is not direct. The mechanisms are different. The violence is more attenuated, more legalized, more hidden behind contracts and clauses and international agreements. but the basic dynamic, private capital organising itself to extract value from complex systems and acquiring the political power necessary to protect that extraction, is recognisable. The VOC and the EIC are the origin story of that dynamic. They are, in a real sense, where corporate power learned what it could become. The spice ships that once sailed the Java Sea are gone now, the great Dutch East Indiamen, with their red and white flags and their crowded holds, the English vessels with their company pennants streaming in the monsoon wind. The trading posts of Surat and Masulipatam have been absorbed into modern cities where no one quite remembers the English factories that once stood there. Batavia is now Jakarta, a city of 30 million people, the capital of the world's fourth most populous nation, a nation that carries within it the deep marks of the VOC's century and a half of rule, and that has been working out its own identity and its own relationship with that history ever since. The Banda Islands are quiet. The nutmeg trees still grow on the volcanic slopes of Banda Nera and on Run and Ai and Banda Besar. A nutmeg looks, when you hold one, like a small, intensely fragrant stone. Dense and dark, carved by nature into something that smells of distant kitchens and old winters. The faint red lace that wraps around it before drying is mace, which is also a spice which was also once sold at extraordinary prices to European buyers who had no idea where it came from or who had grown it. You can buy nutmeg in almost any grocery store in the world now. It costs almost nothing. There is something quietly significant in that fact, that the commodity for which an entire people was destroyed, for which two of the most powerful commercial institutions in human history competed with such lethal intensity, for which Pieterszoon Coen built a city, and the Heeren 17 paid dividends that seem impossible by modern standards. That commodity is now so abundant, so cheap, so unimportant, that it sits on a supermarket shelf between the paprika and the coriander, unremarked and unremarkable. The Nutmeg Islands, that were once the most valuable real estate on Earth, are now among the quieter corners of Indonesia, visited occasionally by divers who come for the coral reefs, and by historians who come to look at the old Dutch colonial buildings and the ruins of the forts, and to try to imagine what this place once meant to the world. The company offices in the City of London, the buildings where the EIC's directors sat and made their decisions about Bengal and Bombay and the Punjab, are offices of different companies now, or have been demolished and replaced, or survive as heritage buildings whose plaques note, in the careful language of institutional commemoration, that something historically significant once happened here, without quite specifying how to feel about it. The headquarters of the EEC stood on Leadenhall Street in the heart of the city, a grand neoclassical building completed in 1799, the same year the VOC was dissolved, as if the architectural universe were marking the transition with pointed symmetry. It was demolished in 1861, less than a decade after the Indian Rebellion and the company's dissolution, replaced by a bank. The bank itself was eventually replaced by something else. History in cities has a way of covering its own tracks. History does not always leave ruins. Sometimes it leaves invisible shapes, patterns pressed into the world by forces that no longer exist in the form they once took, but whose impressions remain. The borders of South Asia are one such impression. The English language in Mumbai and Bangalore and Chennai is another. The corporate form, the joint stock company with tradable shares and limited liability, is perhaps the most profound and far-reaching of all, a financial instrument invented in the counting houses of Amsterdam in the first years of the 17th century that now underlies almost all of the organised commercial activity in the world. The men who designed it, the merchants of Amsterdam who raised 6.4 million guilders on a March morning in 1602, could not have known what they were building. They were trying to solve a practical problem. How do you fund a voyage to the other side of the world and share the risk fairly among many investors? They did not imagine that their solution would produce an institution capable of governing 100 million people. They did not imagine that the device they created would, 4 centuries later, be the dominant organising principle of global commerce. Perhaps this is the most interesting thing about the VOC and the EIC, not the battles they fought or the commodities they traded, or even the empires they built, but the institutional innovations they produced, and the questions those innovations raised, questions that we are still trying to answer. How much power should a private institution be allowed to accumulate? When does commercial interest become political interest, and who gets to decide? What do we owe to the communities from whose wealth corporate power is built? These are not antiquarian questions, they are very much alive. But tonight, they can rest. The ships have sailed, the accounts have been closed, the companies are dissolved, and across the enormous ocean that all of those merchants and soldiers and sailors and factors and governors once crossed and recrossed in their search for pepper and nutmeg and profit, the wind moves without agenda, and the waves follow no charter, and the stars that the navigators used to find their way, the Southern Cross, Orion, the pale spray of the Milky Way, still hang in the same places they have always hung, indifferent to empire, patient as the sea. Let yourself sink a little deeper into wherever you are. Let the story settle, let the images slow. The harbour of Batavia at dawn, the mango groves at Plassey, the nutmeg trees of Banda, the long amber light on the canals of Amsterdam in the early 17th century, when the world was, impossibly, still mostly unknown, and the ships that would change it forever were only just beginning to be built. Somewhere in all that distance, in all that time, is the answer to who was more powerful. But perhaps the more important answer is simpler. Both companies were extraordinary, both were terrible, and both remind us that the most consequential forces in history are rarely the ones that announce themselves as empires. The most consequential forces are often the ones that begin with a charter, and a ship, and a hold full of pepper.